after 9/11, for whatever reason, the forces of intolerance, exclusionary politics, and hegemony really took center stage.
They would expect and want and clearly seek weakness and fear and apprehension and alienation.
في المؤسسة لم يكن من أجل بضعة الدولارات التي كنا نبعثها والتي بالدوب تكاد تكفي احتياج الشعب الفلسطيني، ولكن للطاقة الكامنة التي كانت مخزنة في هذه المؤسسة استطاعت أن توصل عبرات ومعاناة الشعب الفلسطيني.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Rania, Programs Director for CAIR Florida. It is what many of us would only describe as our worst nightmare. Banging at your door in the middle of the night, armed men pushing their way into your home, no uniforms, no identification. A bag is thrown over your head while your family is home, helpless and terrified. You are taken to an undisclosed location and held against your will and continuously tortured. Who are your kidnappers? The US government. And they never charge you with a crime or prosecute you, only kidnap and torture you. While this may seem like the script of a Hollywood flick, for Brother Moazzam Begg, it was a reality. And for those with him who were illegally detained at Guantanamo Bay Prison, they lived this hellish reality for many years. This is Exposed, CAIR Florida's 4-part series highlighting the use of government overreach to erode civil liberties. Today, we see the case of Brother Moazzam Begg, an outspoken human rights advocate and survivor of the War on Terror. Born in Birmingham, England, Mr. Begg was arrested or abducted in Afghanistan in the series of mass arrests of foreigners in the region following 9/11. He was eventually transferred to Guantanamo Bay, where he was detained without charge. After his release from Guantanamo, Moazzam Begg was arrested once more in 2014 for false allegations related to the Syrian civil war, allegations which were later withdrawn. Currently, Moazzam Begg is the director of CAGE, formerly Cage Prisoners, in the UK, a human rights and legal advocacy organization in the United Kingdom that works on behalf of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay and other detainees of the war on crime, the war on terror. Joining me to host the program tonight is CAIR Florida's Chief Executive Director, Mr. Hassan Chibli. Our guest is Moazzam Begg. Welcome, Hassan. Welcome, Mr. Moazzam, Brother Moazzam.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Pleasure for me to be speaking to you at CAIR Florida. I hope that this is
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother Moazzam, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and Rania for the powerful introduction. And you know, this program is one that's very dear and near to me, very special, very important. Just spent the most of this weekend personally trying to reach out to everybody, from our friends and our donors and our allies and our supporters to elected officials, members of Congress, prosecutors. But the world really needs to hear your very riveting and powerful story and the utter injustice that you faced, that countless others have faced, and that countless others continue to face, funded by our own tax dollars as American citizens. So I really, really want to thank you for the effort that you've put in to join us today, the effort you've put in with CAGE, a powerful organization that fights on behalf of those that are wrongfully persecuted. Thank you, Brother Moazzam. It's an honor to have you, and I hope the audience takes a lot from today's program and realizes what you went through, frankly, is still happening, I think, throughout the world. And our government as Americans plays a large part in this injustice, and we have a tremendous responsibility to push back against it.
Yeah, I mean, let me just it's one of the reasons why I continue to do this, even though it was 15 years it's been since I was released from Guantanamo, is that there are still 40 prisoners in Guantanamo, held mostly without charge, and that is a travesty of justice that I think that people in the United States of America Perhaps no, but though enough. Hope that this helps to get some of that.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And we're glad that you'll be able to share your story with a U.S. audience as well today. So today, as you mentioned, you're known as Brother Moazzam Begg, former Guantanamo Bay detainee, the director of Cage UK. But as we like to here at the Exposed series, we like to start at the beginning. So starting with the backstory, can you give us a little bit of insight into growing up in the UK? You've spoken before about your struggle to find your place of belonging, and that, you know, some of your first introductions to racism being from skinheads who targeted the South Asian community in the UK. So can you speak a little bit to that and the significance that it had in your life?
Yeah, sure. Just to backtrack, my father came from Pakistan. They're originally from India. He was born in the city of Agra, the city of the Taj Mahal, and he migrated here after moving to Pakistan in the 60s. And it was here that I was born and raised. I went initially to a Jewish primary school, so it is interesting that during the day I'd learn from the Torah and learn some Hebrew, and in the evening I'd go home and learn the Quran. So I learned the best of both worlds in that regard. I grew up to marry a Palestinian woman many years later, so I understood both sides of the conflict. But the conflict I was having at home in Britain wasn't to do with either of those things. I didn't experience racism at the Jewish school that I went to, but I'd experienced it on the streets with neo-Nazis, racist skinheads who would often say, and they use the term in a very derogatory way, Paki, to say Paki's out, Pakis go back home. And they would regularly attack people of color. And that would be Pakistanis, Indians, black people, Asians, and so forth. So we formed together into a street gang called the Lynx. And our raison d'etre was to fight these neo-Nazis on our streets. I was just a teenager at the time, but many of us, myself included, had got beaten up by them. And so we were born out of that fire and steel against these people. And we were able to clear some of the areas. Now, it's interesting and important because at that time, Islamophobia didn't exist. It was just racism based upon a person's skin color. What's changed from that time till now is that not only does racism exist very clearly, but it also has it's honed in on Muslims. So the irony of this is that you could be a Caucasian, a white Muslim, but the moment you became a Muslim, you became the other. You became part of that other color, as it were. So that's something I've seen as a transition to. And for me, it was important because my own transition was, where did I fit in? Was I Asian? Was I Pakistani? Was I Indian? Was I British? That was a complete confusion of multiple identities. And I found peace eventually, in my early 20s, in my Islamic identity.
Absolutely. And I think what you're describing is something that many children of immigrants, both in the US and the UK, can relate deeply to. I want to ask you also that you've spoken previously that the autobiography of Malcolm X was very meaningful and transformative for you. Can you speak a little bit to the influence that had on your life?
Yeah, I have to say the autobiography of Malcolm X has repeatedly and continues to have a massive influence on my life. As I said, I wasn't really a practicing Muslim up until my early 20s, and I was doing all the bad things that a young Muslim couldn't do. And one day, I mean, I'd heard a song by Public Enemy, who I used to listen to back in those days, and they made mention of Malcolm X, and I didn't really know who the man was. One day I went I was on this search of reading and looking for books about my faith, and I went into this underground section of a bookshop in Birmingham City Centre. And there I saw this book, and on the front of it is this man with this goatee beard and his finger like this, and he's got a ring on his finger on which it says Allah, and he had me intrigued totally. When I picked up the book and read it, and of course come through the chapter when he goes for the Hajj, it was that transformation that helped my own transformation. Around the same year, I also met Muhammad Ali, who'd come over to the UK for a book signing, and I stood about for an hour in the rain and got his autobiography signed. And so these huge characters who were African Americans had this massive influence on me as a son of Pakistani immigrants in the UK because of this connection of through the gang culture, through coming up through what I would call a difficult background. And then the thing that helped to transform his life, as Malcolm X says, was Islam. And for me, that really did it. And I have to say again and again, repeatedly, when I was in Bagram, held by the Americans, I came across this book. I saw Black American soldiers who were reading the book, getting called all sorts of names, called radicals and terrorists, because they had this book with them. I recommended some Black American soldiers to read the autobiography of Malcolm X in Guantanamo, and they did. And as a result, they changed their view towards us, because they saw that history of Islam, in fact, has a great connection to the African Americans. And the irony was that as prisoners were taken by the Americans in chains across the Americas into the American islands. And the last time that had happened en masse, of course, was slavery. So some of them, we made that point for them to understand the parallels.
It's very powerful listening about the impact that the work of Malcolm X has had on you, and subhanallah, it's clear. I mean, only Allah knows the reality, but that it seems that he really was accepted. He's had such a powerful impact, and he ultimately paid for what he believed in and what he stood for with his life. I was in a meeting in DC with some of the top American Muslim civil rights activists and scholars and leaders, and we went around the room to ask what's really impacted our work, what impacted our life, what impacted our faith, and the number one answer given was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. That was the number one answer given by the most people there. So I highly encourage everybody to get a copy of that book and read it. And I do want to ask that you all quickly click the share button, because Brother Moazzam is about to get into a very riveting, personal, harrowing story. It's amazing that the brother that is speaking so eloquently before us right now was spent time in Guantanamo Bay, was effectively tortured at the hands of the U.S. government, treated in the worst of ways, and alhamdulillah, he's with us today to testify about his treatment. So I do want to ask you all to please click the share button, invite others as we continue this conversation. Jazakallah khairan.
Absolutely. And, Brother Moazzam is just with us right now. And, to Hassan's point, I think the Malcolm X has made such an impact on so many people. So sounds like you were going through what many people go through, this challenge with identity formation. You're being grounded more and more in Islam and Islamic values, using the leadership and guidance of activists such as Malcolm X. And then one of your first experiences of direct activism, right, takes us to the Bosnian War, formerly Yugoslavia back then. And there was the largest genocide in Europe since World War II. But for too long, the world was silent about the genocide that was happening in Bosnia. And NATO and the UN had deployed troops, but as you've described previously, they pretty much were sitting back and observing. They weren't really taking action. And so there was a group of volunteer fighters from around the world, Muslims, who went to defend Bosnians in the genocide that the Serbs were executing, and because of the atrocities that were being seen. And so can you speak to us a little bit about your involvement first in the Bosnian genocide, and then I think we'll have some follow-up questions for you.
Well, yes, it was around 1992 when I first started to about in Yugoslavia. I didn't know that there were indigenous, Slavic, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims right here in the heart of Europe. And when I did find that out, of course, that was part of my journey of connecting with the rest of the Muslim world, which I knew was far greater than my own little environment where I lived in. And so when I first saw the Bosnian refugees coming in, there were both Croatian, Catholic Croatians and Muslim Bosnians. They came and they looked no different to any white Western Europeans, other than the fact that they were Muslims. And some of them were only Muslim by name, because they really didn't know much about Islam, because they'd been under the yoke of communism for about 70 odd years at that time. But when I heard the horror stories of some of them, and I have to tell you, they were deeply horrific. Gang rape, murder, razor blades used on children because the soldiers didn't want to waste bullets. They were really horrific stories that I heard firsthand from some of the victims. I remember speaking to one man who told me how they were very close with their Serbian neighbors, and then as the war started, literally mines had been laid by the neighbor, and when he walked outside, both of his legs were blown off. And as he spoke to me, he's taking one leg off and then the other leg off, both of pathetic. And I'm shocked to see that this man has gone through all of this and he's made it to the UK. So I went as part of an aid convoy several times, taking the land route, driving across over 3-4 days, taking food, medicine, blankets, and so forth in to help the Bosnians. But there was one thing that was really shocking, and that was the United Nations forces were there armed to the teeth, with their armored personnel carriers, with tanks, with aircraft, and so forth, under the United Nations banner, while the massacres was taking place. And it is, I cannot overstress this, that the Srebrenica massacre took place, and this is the biggest genocide after World War II that took place against Europe's Muslims, Europe's indigenous Muslims. And the United Nations unifiedly watched, particularly in Srebrenica with Dutch United Nations, invited the Muslims to come in who were fleeing as internally displaced people, and they allowed Ratko Mladic, who was the head of the military of the Bosnian Serbs, to come in and to take all the men and boys over 15 or 16 years old and execute them with a bullet to the back of their head after they were tied up. And this is one of the reasons why I joined what's known as Armia Bosanska, or the third corpus of the Bosnian army, in order to try to help in whatever way I could. I wasn't there very long. There weren't any military operations there during the time when I was there. It was in the winter. But for that short period of time, I felt that I was doing at least some logistical support for these people who had now been abandoned by the world and will be in their tens of thousands.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brother Moazzam. And I also just want to, say if there is any way that we can make the connection switch to LTE, maybe just otherwise I think you're breaking in a little bit, but we'll make do with it because the story is very important to get to the audience, alhamdulillah. I want to ask you something about this involvement that you had in Bosnia. So as you describe it, what was happening is that literally the Bosnian Muslims were being massacred. People were there armed, but not taking any action. And so you went, and we said that there was, people from all over the world that went in defense of the Bosnian Muslims to fight, to defend them. In the US, almost most people here are conditioned to conflate going somewhere to fight, even if it's in the defense of victims of genocide, to conflate that with terrorism or with some wrong action, right? And so what would our response be to those who see that, who view it in that light?
I think it's important that history didn't begin at 9/11, and we've got to remember that the United States has probably supported more, let's say the word openly, the United States has probably supported jihad more times than any Muslim you can think of in the Western world. And how do I say that? Just watch Rambo 3. Sylvester Stallone and his the third edition of Rambo is dedicated. The entire film is dedicated to, and I quote, the brave people of Afghanistan. And these are known as mujahideen. Mujahideen are those who fight jihad. And President Ronald Reagan described the mujahideen as, and I quote, they are like founding fathers of America. In fact, it was the United States supply of the Stinger anti-aircraft weapon system that was designed to knock out the Devil's Chariot, which is the Mi-25 helicopter that was devastating Afghanistan's mud brick villages, that changed the whole direction of the war. These anti-aircraft missiles had a 7-10 kill ratio. So when Afghan mujahideen hit these Russian Soviet helicopters, they hit them with American weapons. And America completely supported the mujahideen. So people need to understand this, and that the United States, Britain, and so forth, they will support causes that they feel are in their interest, whatever it is. So this notion of people fighting abroad and so forth for a cause or not, you cannot call it terrorism. It has to depend on whether it is that the fight is just or not. And America, as I said, has supported some, and on other occasions it has called it terrorism. And I think that needs to be deciphered. Certainly, America bombed the Serbs. We were on the same side at the same time. At that time, the United States recognized, though it would late recognize that a genocide had taken place against Muslims of Europe, and fighting against the genocide isn't terrorism, it's an obligation in my view.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I'm actually going to introduce a small commercial break in our program, and after the commercial break, we'll be right back, and I want to ask you more about your involvement, how you ultimately ended up in Guantanamo Bay, and everything that ensued after that. So we'll be right back after this short trailer for those who missed it as we opened.
After 9/11, for whatever reason, the forces of intolerance, exclusionary politics, and hegemony really took center stage.
They would expect and want and clearly seek weakness and fear and apprehension and alienation.
في المؤسسة لم يكن من أجل بضعة الدولارات التي كنا نبعثها والتي بالدوب تكاد تكفي احتياج الشعب الفلسطيني، ولكن للطاقة الكامنة التي كانت مخزنة في هذه المؤسسة استطاعت أن توصل عبرات ومعاناة الشعب الفلسطيني.
Salam everybody, and welcome back to Exposed. I'm going to bring on my co-host Hassan Shibli. If you're just joining us right now, we're joined for this episode with Brother Moazzam Begg, a former detainee at Guantanamo Bay Guantanamo Bay Prison, never convicted of any crime, never prosecuted, and yet detained and tortured. And we're here to hear more about his story. And I believe Brother Moazzam is back with us.
I'm back.
Salam alaikum. Perfect. This is the day and age that we're in. I know that you mentioned, and maybe we'll get to it later in the program, that you've never actually stepped foot in America aside from being detained at Guantanamo Bay, and so the American audience is left with a virtual platform to kind of hear your story, and this is some of that reality. But alhamdulillah, so catching people up to speed, we're going through an identity formation. You were moved by the principles of Islam, by leaders like Malcolm X. You were moved to actually, live out those values by coming to the defense of those in need. And you went to Bosnia in service of those who were victims of the genocide. And then you take your family and you're living in Afghanistan. And that is the point at which you are kidnapped by U.S. forces and brought to Guantanamo Bay Prison. Can you walk us through that process briefly?
All right, yeah, just to correct that. No, I was in Afghanistan in 2001, but it wasn't from Afghanistan that I was kidnapped. I was kidnapped from my home in Pakistan. So I'd moved with my family to Afghanistan to build a school for girls in Kabul, which is the city center, and we had the school up and running. We helped set up a curriculum. We had equipment, playground equipment brought in. We had a syllabus completely set up and so forth. And the Taliban were not receptive to Western organizations, the education system, but they were receptive to Muslims would come from abroad. When the United States started the bombing campaign of Afghanistan, began in
Want to thank everybody for your patience with us as we're having a small technical difficulties with Brother Moazzam Begg, who's joining us from the UK. But I know, Brother Hassan, that you've had a lot of previous interaction with Brother Moazzam as well, and so maybe you can share some of the most notable aspects of his case that you've been privy to.
Sure. So, and I know the team, you guys are working to bring him on. I think he had, per our request, turned off the Wi-Fi. Sometimes it's stronger without the Wi-Fi, but I think it became a little bit worse. So, inshallah, as soon as we can have him back on, it will be perfect. But yes, I mean, I had the pleasure and honor of meeting with Moazzam Begg in the UK, and he's running an organization called CAIR-FL. And the issue with these situations is that the government misrepresents these individuals in the media, in the public, to make them toxic, right? And it conflates issues. For example, and we have to be very clear about this, within our faith, jihad is part of the faith. But jihad is to strive for good, for justice. It can mean helping the poor, the needy. It can mean the Afghans fighting the Russian invaders who occupied their country. So it can mean a host of things. It certainly never means terrorism and killing civilians and killing the innocent, as some horrific terrorist organizations have done. And unfortunately, when we mislabel their actions as jihad, we are enabling these terrorist organizations and empowering them. So it's very important that we distinguish between mujahideen, who, as Moazzam himself said, the U.S. government itself supported, and jihad, which is a true struggle for justice against injustice, persecution, occupation, versus the horrific acts of terrorism that we all stand against, like what we see ISIS doing, which has just killed thousands and thousands of civilians throughout the Middle East, and 97% of which are victims. So groups like ISIS that have engaged in terrorism and have killed innocent civilians is nothing. You cannot compare those with groups of mujahideen that indeed struggle to fight against occupation within their lands, with every right protected and afforded by international law, which gives people the freedom to resist illegal occupation, even by force, as long as they abide by certain rules of conduct and rules of warfare. And actually published a paper which speaks about the rules of warfare in Islamic law within jihad in comparison to the international law rules of warfare. And you actually find that the Islamic system and the rules of jihad and warfare within the Islamic tradition actually exceeds and is much more stringent than even modern international law. So, for example, modern international law may allow certain types of military actions that Islamic law would forbid. And the reason Islamic law forbids it is because it has a grave toll on innocent human life. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, absolutely forbade the targeting of those that were unarmed, of civilians, of women, of children. So it's very important to recognize that. So unfortunately, what has been done is through the media, through government targeting, they've conflated the two issues with jihad, mujahideen, and terrorism, and they try to paint them all as one and the same, and they're completely different. You cannot put somebody who blows up a bus full of children, a criminal thug like such a person, with somebody who is defending his family's land against foreign occupation. Those are two completely different things, and we have to recognize that, and we cannot treat the two as the same, as unfortunately we far too often have. And in as it relates to Guantanamo in particular, frankly, as you'll hear from Brother Moazzam, you had just a lot of people who didn't even fight occupation, had nothing to do with warfare at all, and who were simply sold out for those hefty bounties, or sold out for political reasons, and ultimately tortured at the hands of the U.S. government. And that torture, unfortunately, has led to the deaths of so many civilians. I think a powerful example that Brother Moazzam and I were discussing earlier, and I hope we can bring him back because I really want to hear from him. So hopefully, we can have him back on as soon as possible. I think he's joining us right now, and he can discuss a little bit later about how torture led to some horrific things, including the Iraq War, wrongfully. So we'll hear from him now that he's back. I was buying time, everybody. So I want to welcome back Brother Moazzam, inshallah, to continue his story. Inshallah. Welcome back, Brother Moazzam.
My apologies for that. I just had to move location a little bit. But just to say, look, I've heard you talking about the whole concept of jihad and so forth. Really, the issue here is that the United States and the people in the United States would be able to recognize very easily if we look at as you've said, the idea of defending yourself is recognized in international law, it's recognized in the United States, it's recognized in Islamic law, it's recognized everywhere. Everybody has the right to defend themselves, which is quite different to somebody going out and carrying an act of violence against civilians. That was never the case in Bosnia and in many of the conflict zones. And unfortunately, much of that has been tainted. But the point that I wanted to kind of get on to, when I was evacuating from Afghanistan, we evacuated under these bombs that are called daisy cutters. Now, that sounds like a lawnmower or something, but it's not. It's a people mower. It weighs 15,000 pounds. That's a bomb. Now, you imagine those bombs dropped in a carpet-like fashion. That's what was happening in Afghanistan with the US-led invasion. So first it started with the cruise missile strikes, and then with the B-52s and the larger planes dropping these bombs. And it was under these bombs that we evacuated. And as a result of that, we don't even know the numbers of people that were killed. There were that many killed. And that was just the beginning of the war on terrorism. What followed afterwards, of course, I'd evacuated to my family's home in Pakistan, and I remained there until the night of the 31st of January 2002. There was a knock on my door. I opened the door, and there was a group of people, all ununiformed, all unidentified, stormed in. One of them put a gun straight to my head and threw me onto the ground. They put my hands behind my back, and they shackled my hands to my legs and put a hood over my head and picked me up physically and carried me to the back of this vehicle. Now, my wife and my children were in the house at this time, and the last thing that I saw before they put the hood and covered my head for the next 3 years, as it were, metaphorically, was them walking into the room where my wife and children were. And when they'd taken me into the vehicle, I was lying in the prone position. They lifted the hood over my head, and there were two men sitting in the front. Now, these two men were not Pakistanis, but they tried to dress very badly, I have to say, as Pakistanis, and they weren't fooling anyone. And they said, you can either answer our questions here, meaning inside Pakistan, or you can answer them in Guantanamo Bay. Now, by this time, the images of these men in orange jumpsuits had shocked the world. So it was January by now, and the first prisoners had been taken there. And so they knew that they were going to frighten me by saying this. People had seen those images of these men with face masks and ear muffs and blacked out goggles, looking like extraterrestrial beings. So I didn't believe that this was happening. I really didn't believe. I didn't know what I'd done to these people. I really genuinely didn't know. What have I done to you guys that you're doing this to me for? And so they took me off to the secret location. I was held by the Pakistanis, but it was all under the auspices of the United States intelligence, CIA, FBI. And after 3 weeks of being held in this place, where I have to say I got it better than other people, because I saw other people being tortured, very, very badly tortured by the Pakistanis. They sent me off to the airport. They took me to this airport where I was handed over to US military personnel. And this US military soldiers, as it were, started to tell me that you're now in the hands of the United States of America, and you will be okay. And that was the biggest lie I'd ever been told.
Thank you, Brother Moazzam, and we're going to get into the details of your experience in Guantanamo Bay in this next segment. But before we get to that, I just want to emphasize a point. So you were kidnapped, detained, arrested multiple times, tortured, and then you were released. Can you share with us how or why you're currently released and not still in detainment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this was this was a period of 3 years. It started in taking me to Kandahar, where I was held. Stripped naked, beaten, tortured. I mean, the list is endless. I saw 2 people beaten to death, murdered by American soldiers, and that's featured in an Oscar-winning documentary called Taxi to the Dark Side, which anybody can watch. So that whole period lasted several weeks, and then I was sent to Bagram, where I was about a year, again, under US military custody. And then for 2 years in solitary confinement in Guantanamo. And then I was released after 2 years. There were no charges. I was never taken to court. I was never told what crime I'd committed to the United States of America. I've never been to America. And let me make this clear. I have never, before this, been west of Ireland. Nothing on that side of the world. The only part of that world I've ever seen in my life has been Cuba. And not real Cuba, but American-owned Cuba, that 45 square mile patch that is rented or taken from the Cuban government by that, and where there's a military base. I have never had any intention to go to that side of the world. So when America bought me, it showed me a face of it that I really did not know and had never seen before. But having said that, I encountered many soldiers, Black, white, Hispanic, West Coast, East Coast, Midwest. I got to know almost everything I know about America from that experience. And I won't say it's all bad, but we can get into it, inshallah, afterwards about what that experience was.
Brother Moazzam, how many years total were you in custody from the first day you were picked up till the day you were released?
Almost exactly to the day, 3 years.
3 years.
3 years,
with zero charges, zero convictions, zero due process.
These ideas of due process, of law courts, prosecution, defense, judges, juries, they didn't exist there.
Of course.
I was a law student, and I understood, and I know that there are, America has Magna Carta as part of its constitution. That's how British America really is. But the point is that none of these ideas, habeas corpus, the right to the body, to be judged by a court of your peers and so forth, all of these things that we take for granted in Britain and in America are all dispensed with in Guantanamo.
And right now, you're a free man in the UK, correct?
I'm as free as any human being, inshallah. We are all Muslims, and we all believe we're captives of sorts. But yes, I am free.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. And I think it's very important that our audience, because you know what, people don't like to have these conversations. They don't like to, they automatically write people off that have been through such horrific things. I think it's very important that our audience, from our community members to our imams, to our elected officials, to our prosecutors, and our friends that are watching this, bear witness that you suffered for 3 years without ever facing any charges, without ever being convicted of anything. And now, alhamdulillah, you are a relatively free man in the UK, which shows that you were never a threat to begin with, and that there was absolutely no justification for the inhumane torture and abuse that you faced and that many others continue to face. And with that, and I do appreciate Sister our dear sister asking Rania about your eventual freedom, but I really do want us to slow down and talk about from your early days of captivity and everything you witnessed and whatever stories you can share, because alhamdulillah we have a decent viewership online, and I want people to hear your testimony, because we as Americans, to be frank, we pride ourselves orally about being people of justice and equity and human rights, but our track record as it relates especially to foreign policy and even domestic policies and law enforcement and the military smacks in the face of everything that we claim to espouse, and that's extremely unfortunate. I mean, our illegal aggressions overseas have killed millions of innocent civilians. We've clearly tortured and abused thousands within our own prisons, both at home and abroad. So I do want people to really hear the details firsthand from somebody like yourself, and to start really with what happened in Pakistan, because I think a lot of people, unfortunately, especially from the Muslim community, I mean, some will be surprised, some won't be, but you witnessed torture and abuse under the hands of the Pakistani government before you were turned over to the Americans, who then said, "Oh, now you're going to be safe," but they were liars as well. So let's talk a little bit about each, and I know this may be very difficult, but may Allah reward you for recounting this for everyone. If you can recount, from when they first took you out of your home and sort of go through that step by step, and some of the most horrifying and memorable moments, as difficult as it is for you, may Allah reward you. It's important that we speak truth to power, and you've been doing that your whole life since, so may Allah reward you for sharing your testimony today.
Well, yes, I was taken in Islamabad to the headquarters, or to one of the interrogation centers of the ISI, which is the Inter-Services Intelligence of Pakistan. Now, they said to me very, very quickly, look, and they used the endearing term in Urdu, beta, which means son. And they said, look, we know you've not done anything here, not wanted for anything. You're completely legal here, but this is the Americans and your government and the British, primarily the Americans, but also the British are complicit.
So from day one, they acknowledged you're clear, you're innocent, you've done nothing wrong.
Yeah,
but fact, the Americans are forcing our hands in this.
In my book, I have a chapter called Illegally Detained. And they said to me that you have been, remember, this is the intelligence service of Pakistan, an official arm of the government, that said you have been illegally detained.
Wow.
I said, sorry, can you say that again? You have been illegally detained. I said, what does that mean? It means you've been detained at our behest and there's nothing you can do about it. It's illegal. But we're essentially acting outside of the law because the United States has told us that we must do this. And I met British intelligence agents as well, who also said that you have to cooperate with the United States. There's nothing we can do for you. The best we can do is offer you a glass of water. And within 3 weeks of this, and again, I have to say, they didn't beat me, they didn't torture me, but they did do it to people in front of me. This is the Pakistanis. And I can't describe the type of, I saw one man being literally whipped and screaming. And I couldn't imagine that this was happening. And the only thing you can think in a situation like that is that I'm next. And what was happening here is something that the United States did across the board. It wasn't just the Pakistanis. In fact, Pakistanis were relatively tame compared to what happened to other nations and other nationals. People were sent to all over the place, to Morocco. I know one individual who was in Guantanamo, a razor blade was taken to his private areas and his genitalia. It's documented, deeply documented about what happened to him. Another I met, he'd been wrapped in chains, taken from Indonesia to Egypt, and then brought to Bagram, which is where I met him. And he said they threatened to rape his stepmother, and that's why he was cooperating with the CIA. I mean, the list of these people, I cannot tell you. There are so many of them. I saw two people. One person, his name was Dilawar. He's a taxi driver. He was brought in front of the cell where I was in. It was a communal cell where about 10 of us were. And there was an area where they would lock off the prisoner before they come in or out of the cell. And they tied his hands to the top of the cage and left his hands suspended with a hood over his head for days until his body slumped. The guards opened the door and started to punch him, give him punches in his ribs repeatedly to see if he's putting it on. And then they took him off to the interrogation room afterwards. I didn't know at the time, but they killed him that night. He was murdered. And he was murdered because of one thing that would shock all of you. And that is, the soldiers found it funny. They found it amusing that this soldier, that this prisoner would say Allah, Allah every time he was kicked. And what they did is they knew it's a strike that's known by the military and the police called a peroneal strike. It's like a Thai boxing style kick that's delivered to the top of the thigh to make a person more compliant. His hands were tied to the top of his head while he was being kicked, and soldiers found it funny, one after the other, that they kicked him so many times. The autopsy report on Dilawar said that had he survived, his leg would have required amputation, and that it said that it looked as if his leg had been run over by a truck. And that, as I said, his death is featured in the film called Taxi to the Dark Side that won the Oscar for Best Documentary in 2008. Again, you know what's the really shocking thing about this? I'll tell you what. In 2004, I'd been sent now to Guantanamo after this. I'd been a year in Bagram. I was now in Guantanamo in solitary confinement. One day, two interrogators came along. These interrogators called themselves from the Criminal Investigation Department. They'd say, 558, which was my number, could you identify for us amongst these photographs the soldiers that were present that night when Dilawar was killed? And then they showed...
What their nationalities are, real quick, those soldiers who killed him?
They're all Americans. There's nobody but Americans. This is purely Americans.
So these are American soldiers who killed the man who kept saying Allah, Allah as they were torturing him.
Absolutely, yes. American
in
soldiers.
U.S. custody, American soldiers.
Yeah, and I identified them. I knew their names. I knew them by name, though I wasn't supposed to because they didn't cover their name tags. But I knew them because I was an English speaker. I'd pick it up immediately. And so they asked me to identify. They were the ones who confirmed to me that Dilawar had been murdered. They asked me to identify a photograph of his body. So I identified him. This was a year after the fact. And then they showed me the photographs of the pictures of the soldiers. And they said, who was on duty that night? And I pointed them out one by one by one by one. And eventually there was a case against them, but each received either a dishonorable discharge, demotion, or I think one of them received a couple of months in a military brig for murder, cold-blooded murder. And I promised the Americans when I saw them in the interrogators, I said, I promise you that whenever I'm freed, 5 years, 4 years, 2 years, 15 years, I will let the world know what was done here on that night.
Thank you for speaking out. And just say again, what was his name, this man who was killed in cold blood by their hands?
His name was Dilawar, and the film that is about his life or his death is called Taxi to the Dark Side.
Taxi to the Dark Side. If we can get that running, and I want you all, my friends, take action. You know, speak out about this, share this video, host your friends, bring Taxi to the Dark Side, watch it virtually, watch it in person. We cannot enjoy the liberty that the United States offers us while funding the injustice it does without speaking out against it. So this is a duty we all have, and I believe, especially for us living in Florida, Guantanamo Bay is less than an hour flight from here in a small Cessna airplane. It's very close. It's so close to us. And yet we're allowing this injustice to happen without fully expressing our opposition to it with every available political means. We need to organize politically. We need to speak out. We need to fight back and learn from the horrible history that we have. So, Brother Moazzam, please continue.
Yes. So there's one more thing I must say, and this is probably the most difficult to swallow because of how much it affects every single one of us. In May 2002. I was in Bagram interrogated by the CIA. And the CIA, they said to me that if you do not cooperate with us, we will do to you what we did to a man called Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, a Libyan man who they captured in the early days of the War on Terror, who they believed was a member of Al-Qaeda. He wasn't, but that didn't stop them doing what they did. And what did they do to him? They'd interrogate him. They said he sat on the very seat where I was sitting. And they said that he didn't cooperate with us, so we sent him on a journey. And his journey took him, I learned later, to a ship in the Persian Gulf called the USS Bataan. And there he was taken alive in a coffin with some holes made so he could breathe. And from this coffin, he was taken onto the USS Bataan, held there for a while, and then taken to Egypt. And in Egypt, in Cairo, he was interrogated, we believe, directly by Omar Suleiman, who was the intelligence chief of Hosni Mubarak. And there he gave the most infamous confession that is in our living history. And that is that he, as a member of Al-Qaeda, first lie, was working with Saddam Hussein on obtaining weapons of mass destruction, second lie. This information was taken and presented to Colin Powell, who was the US Secretary of State at the time. And in 2003, Powell took that information and said, we have credible evidence that Saddam is working with Al-Qaeda to the United Nations. And that became one of the key justifications to invade Iraq. Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, after this, wasn't sent to Guantanamo because everybody in Guantanamo, their case gets heard at some point or the other. He was sent to that one place that would have disappeared him for the rest of his life. He was sent back to where he originally came from, Libya. In May 2009, he turned up in his cell, dead, hanged. During the revolution in Libya, I went in 2012 and I walked into the cell where Libya supposedly took his life. I spoke to prisoners who'd been right next to him on the left and the right, and they said he was not. There is no way, and I saw there's no way that you can hang anything to kill yourself, though I'm no expert. And they said he did not kill himself. He was killed. And he was left to die. He was left to rot. And so this ended the tale or the story of Ibn Sheikh al-Libi. Most people don't even know about it, but it was because of this. Again, you'll see it in Taxi to the Dark Side, that Colin Powell used that false testimony that turned out to be completely fake, torture-induced, to justify the invasion of Iraq.
How many people died as a result of the illegal invasion in Iraq?
You know, people are still dying, aren't they? Because what that caused, of course, if you know that when the invasion of Iraq happened, there was no weapons of mass destruction, and more importantly, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda came into Iraq afterwards under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and set up his organization, which eventually became Islamic State in Iraq. Islamic State in Iraq then reformulated itself with Baathists and others in Camp Booker, American prisons again. 17 of the leaders of ISIS were held in Camp Bukka.
Wow.
And they went on to set up the infamous bogus Islamic State and destroy the Muslim world as well as other people's worlds. So you can see, if you look at the numbers of people that died as a result of that invasion, I think it's still counting, but it's in the millions.
It's in the millions, and people need to wake up and understand. I mean, ISIS, Daesh, they would not exist had it not been for the illegal invasion of Iraq, had it not been for what those prison environments produced and a lot of the trouble. So I think, you know, the United States is very culpable for the creation of ISIS simply by destabilizing the region through the illegal invasion of Iraq. And what's so mind-blowing, there's a reason I asked you how many people died. I think we agree it's in the millions. That all happened because of lies that came out of torture that was sanctioned by the U.S. government. So we see that, you know, one bloody trail leading to even greater bloodshed, unfortunately.
Sorry, the other thing about this is it's really important to understand that it shows that the war on terrorism, the United States didn't do this by itself. The United States had lots of willing participants from the Muslim and the non-Muslim world. Britain, my own country, I know, took part in its intelligence officers, were involved in our interrogation and so forth. And we've taken them to court and taken to task and so forth through intelligence committees and inquiries. But more disturbingly, for those who think that the United States wouldn't work with these countries, I've got news for you. People were sent as part of the extraordinary rendition program. They were sent to Libya. They were sent to Egypt, and they were sent to Syria, Assad, Syria. That's important. People understand this. We documented multiple cases of people sent via the Americans to Syria. There are several Canadians, of course, as you know, Maher Arar, Abdullah Maliki, and many others who've been compensated by the government because of their government's role in their torture in Syria. And so, in this so-called war on terrorism, even those countries that were supposed to have been the bad guys, as it were, that you'd say in America, that didn't stop intelligence cooperation and the rendition program. The Americans used to threaten me, said, if you don't cooperate, we'll send you either to Egypt or to Syria. And they had done that already.
Subhanallah. Yeah. This is very powerful. I know Rania is going to kill me. She wants to take us back on track, but it is very important, Rania. That
I actually want to double down on this, but we have some great clips, and so I want to make sure that we can include it, because, you know, part of it is that I think sometimes we speak to individuals who are like-minded, right? So what we're hearing is very shocking, is the fact that false confessions under duress, under torture, may have led to the invasion of Iraq, right? And all of the deaths that you've mentioned, Hassan. But the other side, right? So the people who would say that actually, you know, torture is needed because we're dealing with enemy combatants, because we're dealing with a threat that is so big, that is so vast. And when we're talking about the other side, you know, maybe it's a poor choice of words, but there are many people in the US who would maintain this. And so I actually want to spend a little bit of time on this torture, and Brother Moazzam, you can speak more to your experience. I know there were some truly horrifying things, even hearing women's screams and being told that it could be your wife. I do have to warn the audience, we have some images, so viewer discretion is advised. We have some images of torture that happened in Guantanamo Bay. And so I want to highlight, you know, also some clips about when we say elections have consequences, right? So obviously this is something that was sanctioned by the state. And former director of the CIA of Central Intelligence, John Graham, had said that enhanced interrogation techniques were used and did produce intelligence that helped thwart attack plans and capture terrorists and save lives. And this is the justification that's used, right? New CIA appointee Gina Haspel has been a proponent of torture. I mean, Mike Pompeo, I mean, the list goes on and on. Our current president, we actually have a clip, if we can run the clip now. Here's what his thoughts on torture are.
Would you allow U.S. interrogators to waterboard terrorist prisoners in order to extract information?
Absolutely.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's the leader of, you know, the democracy of the West, right? The leading free nation. And so many people will push back and say that, you know, in some ways, you know, you don't get to Guantanamo Bay unless you're a dangerous person. And, you know, we do what we need to do in order to get the information. And you're saying that actually that and actually not just you, but other organizations who do this research say that most confessions that come under duress as a result of torture are actually false, right? So can you speak more to that? And also, you know, we'll be showing the images as you kind of describe some of the torture that yourself and other detainees went through. But I do agree with Hassan that it's a difficult conversation, but it is important for our audience to see and to be uncomfortable with the realities of what was done with our taxpayer dollars and in the name of the US.
Look, first of all, there is an absolute prohibition on torture in international law. America cannot say, you cannot say that we believe in torture and then have it in your constitution that torture is illegal. It is either illegal or it isn't. You can't make it up as you go along. Now, let's just give one example, waterboarding. Waterboarding was a technique used during the war on terrorism by the CIA against various suspects. Now, waterboarding in Spanish, in the original, was used by the Spanish inquisitors against Muslims and Jews. In Spanish, it's called tortura del agua, torture of the water. So you can't even change its name. You can't. Waterboarding might sound like it's like some kind of sea sport, but it's not. It's called water torture. Now, listen to this. Japanese soldiers who waterboarded American GIs during World War II were prosecuted for war crimes and executed. Understand this, because Donald Trump said that I would waterboard and a lot more, meaning that if it's not torture when the Americans do it, but it is torture when anybody else does it, there's a problem. ISIS reportedly waterboarded some of the American victims that they killed, some of the journalists and some of the aid workers that they killed. And they've actually cited that the Americans, this is what the Americans do. They also dressed their victims in orange jumpsuits before they executed them. So now the problem of this, Obama said, if you remember, he said that ISIS is an unintended consequence of our actions. And what is that action? Torture, invasion, and the murder that comes with all of that. You cannot say to the rest of the world that you are against torture. The first Bush administration, so you understand, what they did is that the lawyers, the attorneys general like Jay Bybee, Alberto Gonzalez and others, actually crafted the famous torture memos in which they argued that if it isn't organ failure, severe physical impairment, or death, then it's not torture. And they reframed it and said that this is actually just enhanced interrogation techniques. We don't torture. When Obama came into office, one of the things that he promised, he said that I will put an end to torture. Well, how can you end something that's not going on? That means it is happening. So he put an end to torture, but he carried it. He finished it off instead with the drone program and to kill people extrajudicially. Because nobody was prosecuted under Obama, remember it's important that the torture tapes of Abu Zubaydah and other people were destroyed, and he allowed for that immunization of those CIA agents. Nobody was prosecuted, right? So when Trump comes along, he can easily say, I would torture, because anybody else who had said it would have been prosecuted. If I said to you that I advocate torture, I'd get arrested right now. If I say I advocate for the torture of whoever I want to, if you said it, you'd be it's an arrestable offense because you're advocating a war crime. Trump can say this because his predecessor, Obama, didn't prosecute anybody for those war crimes. And that's really the sad part of all of this.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, one of Obama's many yet greatest failures is failing to prosecute the war crimes admitted that happened under the previous administration, and frankly, much of which continued throughout his administration. I mean, we can't forget even the signature drone strikes, and people are shocked when I share with them about this, as you know, where the U.S. government under the Obama administration was literally blowing up individuals without knowing even who they were killing, often killing women and children, simply because they fit a signature, a particular pattern that maybe they're involved in resistance, what would be at that time within their own homelands, and thousands of civilians been killed there. Your story, I think, on a personal level, is very riveting, and I do want us to go into details. So before, because I know Rania wants to push us up into a lot of theological, political, deep discussions on civil rights, impact law, which is great. But for me, you know, I'm much simpler. I want to understand the basics first. So you were picked up in the middle of the night, taken from your family, arrested at that time by the Pakistani intelligence, who then took you and then admitted to you that you were illegally detained, that there was no justification for it. The law does not permit it, and yet you had no choice. It was being directed by the Americans. You said you were held so walk us through then chronologically. How long were you held there in the Pakistan? And then you were given to the Americans in Bagram. Just walk us through sort of chronologically what happened in the major events.
The chronology of this is that I was taken in February 2002, held for about 3 weeks by the Pakistanis, but interrogated by the Americans. So the Pakistanis facilitated American interrogations at these different sites. Then so from there...
Sorry, just let me pause you there. So you're held for 3 weeks by the Pakistanis. The Americans are coming and interrogating you. Meanwhile, you may not have been physically beaten at that point, but you're witnessing the Pakistanis doing that to others. The Americans are aware that this is happening. They have no qualms with it, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. I mean, they were doing a lot more than that. People have been getting shot and so forth. These nighttime raids were happening and people were being brought in and so forth. So I was witnessing a lot of this stuff. But as I said, they didn't think the very apologetic Pakistanis were very apologetic towards me, but not apologetic enough to let me go. Because I believe, and this is the other thing, President Musharraf, who was the president of Pakistan at the time, said, and I quote, "I received bounty money of millions of dollars from the Americans for the people that I handed over." And we have the same book publisher. And I remember the publisher saying, "Oh my God, how can we publish books from the same people? One received money for selling people over, and the other one was one of the guys sold over."
Wow.
But there you go. And I remember these leaflets, they were falling. I remember in Afghanistan, these leaflets, before the bombing happened, they were falling. And Donald Rumsfeld said that they are falling like snowflakes in Chicago in December. That's the term he used, you know, almost making it sound poetic. And that these leaflets offered bounty money for any poor Afghan villager who wanted to hand somebody over or to report somebody and say, "Oh, I think he's a suspect. Perhaps you need to go and arrest him." And that's how the majority of people were handed over to the US. They weren't captured on the battlefield. They weren't captured fighting the Americans. They were taken from their homes, people like me. And it wasn't just Pakistan. It was the world was your oyster. People were detained from all over the world, from Indonesia, from Azerbaijan, from Zambia, from Gambia, you name it. These people were handing people over to the Americans because President Bush said, "What? You are either with us or you're with the terrorist. There's nothing in between. There's no Switzerland. There's no, there's no Sweden. There's no place that was neutral.
Right.
You're either with us or with the terrorists." And that's what happened. That hundreds, in fact, thousands were handed over to the Americans for the bounty money, and which the numbers of people I can tell you held in Guantanamo for absolutely zero reason at all. In fact, the majority, there were people there still that I know, people I've been campaigning for 15, 16, 17 years without charge or trial, not held by Burma or by Guatemala, but by the most powerful advocate of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in the world. That, again, people need to think about that.
Absolutely. And what's insane about this, I think, you know, for example, if me and you were neighbors and we have some sort of dispute, business dispute, whatever dispute, literally I could call the Americans without any evidence, sell you to them, literally get a nice wad of cash, and you disappear and end up in jail for years. And you're telling me that's probably the majority of people that you may have come across who were in prison were in situations like this.
I'll tell you one story that I know. Is that two poor Afghan guys came up with an idea amongst themselves, and one said, "I'll sell you over. We'll go half on the money when you return. Surely they'll know that you're not a terrorist. But by the time you come back, we'll have some money together, and I'll split it with you." And the poor guy ended up in Guantanamo for God knows how, like at least 3 years. Wow. So poverty, poverty can lead to this kind of behavior. Of course it can. And when you exploit that poverty by saying we're going to give you free money to sell people over, that's exactly what happened.
Right. So then, continuing your story, you're there for a few weeks. Again, it makes sense. You know, you said the Pakistanis were a little bit nicer to you. Most likely, you know, you had been bought. You know, they sold you basically to the Americans. And then tell us about the transfer, because what you left it off saying the Americans said you're going to be safe with us. And then what happened? What was the next thing? They take you to the Pakistanis, and then what?
Yeah. So when I was handed over to the Americans, it was at this air base, a Pakistani air base, and I had a hood over my head. I couldn't make out who was in front of me, but I heard the voices, and they were very distinctly American. I was able to look down a little bit through my hood, and I could see those khaki sort of desert boots that the soldiers are wearing. And I said to him, "Are you guys going to torture us?" I said to somebody who was in front of us, and you know, a very stern voice replied, "No, son, we don't do that." And he was lying from the back of his teeth, because what they did next was got to be the most humiliating process I've ever been through in my life. They forced me into the bowing position, into ruku position as a Muslim. If you know, into a bowing position with one soldier threading his hand over onto my shoulder, and then the other one doing it this way. I'm a short person, so when they did it, they lifted me off. So I'm in almost like a strappado position. I felt like the sockets, my arms were going to come out the sockets. And then they shackled my hands behind my back, they shackled my legs, carried me off into this aircraft, and then they flew us into Kandahar. Now, this situation occurred where I was sitting next to somebody. I was strapped, my legs were strapped onto the C-130 transport plane. My head was hooded, my hands behind my back. But I noticed that there's somebody next to me, and somebody said, "Salam alaikum." And I said, "Wa alaikum salam." And it turned out he's a Libyan who was next to me. And this brother, subhanAllah, I mean, praise be to Allah, he said, "Akhi, did you pray Salat al-Maghrib? Did you pray the sunset prayer?" I said, "No, I didn't even think about prayer at this point." No. He said, "I think time for prayer has come." Now this guy, I can't see him. I can only hear him. And all of this time, they're shouting and screaming. American soldiers are screaming at us. Dogs are barking. The din, the roar of the engines. And all of this time, this guy says to me, "I think we should pray." I said, "Brother, you're on the left, so you're the imam, you lead." And that's how I prayed my first prayer in American custody, with my hands behind my back and my head hooded. And this man, now interesting, the American soldier came over to me, put a knife to my neck. He said, "If you speak again, I'll slit your throat." At this point, the brother said, now I think about it, it's funny. As soon as that happened, the brother said, "Allahu Akbar." And he started to pray. As you can see, my throat didn't get slit, and we carried on. But that was one of my most memorable introductions into US custody, but it was just the beginning, because then when we landed into Kandahar, it was even worse.
Where did they take you? So you landed into Kandahar. This is a few weeks after you've been arrested.
So this is straight on that journey, that very journey that I was talking to you about. We've been handed over, now we're flying over from Pakistan into Kandahar. I land into Kandahar. They drag me, the American soldiers drag me through the mud. It's freezing, it's quite cold at that time in December, January, February. And they drag me through the mud, and then a soldier sits on top of me, his knees on my head, and you know, it's pushing my neck down. And this is when I remember when the whole thing happened with George Floyd. Instantly brought back memories. These are American soldiers. By the way, some of these are military police. So they are, many of them back home are police officers. And I got to know this. So they were using a technique on me that they had learnt in their training. There's a knee on my neck, and I barely can breathe. I've written about this in my book. And I say, "Please, I can't breathe. I can't breathe." And he lifts the hood over my head a little bit, and he says, "Don't thank me," because I say thank you. He said, "Don't thank me, and don't take my kindness as weakness." The next thing he did is that he took a knife and he sliced off my clothes, from my trousers to everything underneath. I can feel that cold steel against my skin as it's ripping my clothes off. Then he and another soldier take me off again in that position I described to you earlier on, and they spray something on me. There's dogs barking around, salivating, screaming. They're screaming curses in Arabic and Urdu in strange American accents because they've learnt these new words. They're spitting on us. They're making fun, saying things to do with terrorism and 9/11 as if we had something to do with it. Most prisoners don't even speak English, but I do. And then they take us and photograph us in this way. And one of them, the soldiers, I remember, he's seeing all these old Afghan guys who had beards since they were, teenagers. They shave their, beards off like sheep, like they're shearing sheep. And they see these men cry. Some of these men fought the Soviet Union. They're brave. They're very brave men. But it's just their manhood that's being shaved off, and they're crying. And the soldier said, "This is the part that I like best." And so this humiliation is taking place, and I'm taken into this interrogation tent where there are two agents from the I can see they've got FBI caps on, and I'm there naked, shackled, shivering, and they're asking me, "When's the last time you saw Osama bin Laden?" I said, "I've never seen him. I've never seen him in my life."
Wow.
I'm shivering there. And they said, "Oh, you speak English?" I said, "Yes, because I'm from England. That's what they speak there." And he says, "Oh, well, I speak English too, and I've been to England too." And I thought, "That's very nice. That's really, I'm really happy for you. Can I get some clothes?" And so eventually they put on these signature jumpsuits that became infamous now with detention, and they put me into this converted barn. It's a metal barn that's been converted using razor wire to divide the cells, and they've shaved my hair off. They've shaved my beard off. If I had access to a mirror, I wouldn't have known who I was. I would have never known that this is me. So again, this is just the first 24 hours in U.S. custody. We haven't got enough time to go over the whole thing. And I said, I will say again, I got it light compared to many of the other prisoners. I'm an English speaker. I understand. I got along with some of the guards and the soldiers. We were able to converse and so forth. They weren't all evil. But as I said, the worst case scenario is where people were killed.
And I want us to continue from this point in a second, but you really hit on something profound, and you made that connection. I want to make sure the audience understood that, which is, they were trained to put their knee on your neck to the point where you're shouting what has far too often been the last words of Black American men in this country at the hands of law enforcement, which is, "I can't breathe." I can't breathe. I can't breathe, because these officers' feet and legs are crushing you at the neck, choking you. And which shows us that what's happening in the U.S. is not random. It's almost like the chickens haven't come home to roost. This is a byproduct of the injustice and aggression that has happened overseas. It's just simply coming back now. I'm sure a lot of these officers that are doing these things domestically, as you mentioned, probably had experience and were hardened in overseas. Can you speak briefly to that?
Recently I made a post when I saw what happened to George Floyd. I actually used that terminology. I actually said the chickens have come home to roost. You can't mete out this violence to the rest of the world and not have your own soldiers, who many of whom are look, just so you understand it. A lot of I didn't know any of these terms before, but the National Guardsmen and reservists, they were not full-time duty soldiers. Many of them, they were activated during the war on terrorism, and they had to go and serve alongside active duty soldiers. And so many of these were actually law enforcement officers before. Some of them are prison officers. Some of them who were involved, there were MPs. We used to get to the prisoners in Guantanamo don't even know the soldiers as soldiers. They don't call them soldiers. They call them MPs. So these are police already. These are military police. Now, the police you have in the United States of America are militarized police, and they are militarized, and you can't escape the role that many of them have played in serving in wars abroad and coming back, and that exchange of ideas and training, and the militarization of the police. You just cannot escape it. And so when I saw some of these tactics being used in America as they are, I remember very clearly. I remember that American soldier's knee in my neck. I remember watching it on necks of other prisoners, and they also couldn't breathe. And if there's no recognition of what Americans have been doing abroad, how are they going to understand what's happening at home?
We actually have a
Go
clip
ahead.
from your recent post making this connection. I think it is very critical. So I'd like to play it actually now and spend a few minutes talking about this connection that people often fail to make. So we'll go ahead with the clip now.
Then I sit here to tell you today that I know what it's like to sit under the boot of an American heel, to have his knee pushing my face into the ground while he's on the land of my forefathers, telling me that he is dominant, telling he that his way of life is the one that will be, is the one to follow. If that's the case with the rest of the world, my brothers and sisters and friends who are watching from other places, then imagine how mad it must be for people who are having to live through what is happening in America today.
Powerful, and I hope people do make that connection, because you know the problems we're dealing with, systemic racism, police brutality, Islamophobia, the aggressive wars overseas, they're all interconnected, I think, and rooted in some of the same problems of supremacy and arrogance and greed and a whole host of other things we can discuss. But again, before Rania sort of takes us down the more academic discussions, I want to continue the story. So you mentioned now what happened to you when you first met those FBI agents. This was in Kandahar. Where were you, and how long did you spend there, and what was going on there? What was your experience there?
So I was in Kandahar for about 6 weeks or so. Kandahar was a makeshift prison built right next to the airport, built by the Marines, I think. And it was a place to quickly process people to send them to Guantanamo. And here it was again, the situation is so hard to describe. But for example, when I was out of this barn where I'd been for quite some time, my floor was mud. That's it. My walls are razor wire, and my light is an American soldier standing above a floodlight with an M16 pointed towards me constantly. When I am taken out to interrogation, I'm made to lie on the floor, my hands behind my back, my legs behind my back. Two soldiers storm in, one points a gun, two of them shackle me up, and they move me along with my hands again, as I said, in the bowing position. The amount of times I heard this sound, shh, with a gun and a chamber being rounded towards me, I cannot tell you how often, whether it's a shotgun or an M16 or a handgun, to frighten. The purpose of this is to frighten. And because this is happening so often, it almost becomes like second nature to hear this sound, and you're no longer afraid. After about 6 weeks of this, just before this, I get put into a communal cell with other prisoners. They give us one bucket. It's a metal bucket to use between ourselves for the toilet. And it is there's no water to wash with. There's one little bottle of water to drink, and we do tayammum, which is the dry ablution. We just tap our hands on the floor and rub the dust and wipe our faces that way. There's no wudu or the ritual purification that Muslims can do, because there's not enough water to do it. And so eventually, after all of this, I'm sent to Bagram, which is ironically a converted warehouse built by the Soviet Union. So here you've got two superpowers that have taken over the world's most poor country and are fighting over it. And now they've taken over this place. You can still see the inscription in Russian on the walls. And in Bagram, it is where these interrogations take place. And one of the interrogations, or multiple interrogations by the CIA and FBI against me, lasted over a period of a couple of months, which was very shocking. And during that time, they threatened to send me to Syria or to Egypt, as I told you about Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. But they also tied my hands behind my back, hog-tied me, kicked me and punched me. And at that time, they subjected me to the sounds of a woman screaming that I was led to believe was my wife. They brought pictures of my children in front of me that they seized from my house, and they waved them in front of me while these screams are happening and said, "Where do you think your children are now? Who do you think has got them? Where do you think your wife is now?" They didn't actually say my wife is in custody, but they wanted to induce the feeling and fear into me. And that had the desired effect, as it were.
Those are all the Americans doing that. American soldiers, American trained, American funded by our tax dollars, making these horrific torturous acts.
Yes, I mean, I can't list to you the amounts of abuses that I saw and witnessed, and other people told me about, or the screams I used to hear every single night for quite some time. And again, I'll say it to you as best as I can. I got it light compared to others.
Okay, and this was at Bagram. So what happened? You know, you've given us some very painful experiences that were there. The torture you faced, the psychological torture, the physical torture. What happened next? How long were you there? And then what was the transition? Where did you end up after that?
So I was there for about 11 months, and as I've explained to you before, I saw 2 people get beaten to death, Dilawar, the taxi driver, and so forth, over this period of time. And then eventually, after all of this, again, I'd not seen natural light for a year. I'd not had water to make wudu for a year. I'd made tayammum, or the dry ablution, for a year. I'd not had hot food for a year. They just gave us these 2 MREs, meals ready to eat, which was just the packet that we didn't even have a spoon with, because that could be a potential weapon. So we'd have to rip this packet open and you know, drop it all over your face and try to eat some as you could. Ramadan went and came and went. I didn't know Ramadan had happened. We didn't know the fasting time. We couldn't see sunlight or the darkness. When we did get food in Ramadan, it was about 4 hours after the fast had opened. Eid came and went. Didn't know, didn't care, or they didn't care rather. So there was a lot of things taking place. And in the midst of all of this, it was the abuse. So by the time I was finished with this place, I was looking forward to going to Guantanamo. And that sounds funny, but I was actually looking forward to going to Guantanamo.
Wow.
And I did in February 2003. That's exactly where they took me.
You knew it was coming, or they just surprised you, or what happened? To walk us through that.
I was hoping for it, because there were other people going. I wasn't sure why they kept me for so long. Normally they kept people there for a couple of months, but they ended up keeping me for almost a year.
Wow.
And I have to say Bagram was far worse than Guantanamo. And eventually they put me onto this plane. They tied my hands. This time I was seated onto a plane. There was a face mask. There were ear defenders and
Did you notice you were leaving, or they just sort of picked you up one day randomly?
Well, there's a board. They have a leaderboard in which they write the numbers, and the color coding system tells you who's going to go. But I had some friendly guards. I have to say, in all of this, we haven't talked about this, but there were friendly guards everywhere. Even in Kandahar, there were always friendly guards, always decent ones, and I can never forget them. And I'll tell you later about how some of us became really good friends. And those decent guards always kept me abreast about what's happening. If I didn't know, they'd let me know. And so I wasn't in the dark the way a lot of non-English speaking prisoners were. And so eventually they took me seated like this. It was so painful because my hands were shackled to the armrests. My legs were shackled. I begged one of the corpsmen, please, can you just give me something to knock me out? So they put an injection into me. 36 hours later, because I think they stopped for refueling in Turkey or something, I was in Guantanamo, and I woke up in a daze. And all I remember is that they'd taken me somewhere again, stripped me naked, and I was hosed down, and you know, like out of the movies, and then redressed and then taken off into this place where I was held in solitary confinement for the next almost 2 years.
Solitary,
complete solitary. It was a cage, an 8 foot by 6 foot cage, a wire mesh cage inside a room where you cannot see anything outside of this room. There's just a soldier on the other side, and white walls and freshly painted walls and freshly painted wire mesh, and your toilet is all locked down. It's metal, and the sink is all part of that, a traditional, I think, American prisons type thing, and a metal bunk, and that's it. Toilet roll, soap, and a toothbrush that fits on your finger are all comfort items. If you commit any infractions against the rules, then your toilet paper gets taken away from you, and it's dispensed 3 rolls, depending on your interpretation of the standard operating procedure. It's either 3 rolls over the hand or simply 3 sheets, and that's it. That's how it works. It is a system that is designed to dehumanize.
Were you singled out for solitary confinement, or was this just a practice among all the detainees?
No, I was singled out. I was singled out for 3 reasons, I think. And my view is this. One reason is that I signed a confession. when I was in Bagram, when they would make me believe that my wife's being tortured, they said, you either sign this or you're going to more of this is going to happen. So I signed something. I didn't even know what it was. I just signed it. I said, okay, whatever you want me to do, I'll do. So I think they wanted to use me as some kind of case, which would be easy because I'm an English speaker. Two is because I saw these deaths, and I warned them that I will let everybody know. And three, I was an English speaker, and I think they were worried that I would be able to influence other prisoners by things that I hear and so forth. I think all those three different reasons kept me in solitary confinement for most of the time. I was put into general population afterwards, but for most of the time I was in solitary.
I want to talk about your time in Guantanamo, but before we jump into that, and I know we're mindful of time, but this is very important. People need to hear this message. The friendly guards that you spoke of, who may be giving you notice that, hey, you may be leaving, maybe helping you out to whatever ways they could, but they still allowed a lot of this injustice to happen. Why? You mentioned maybe you built a connection. They could see the humanity within you. They could communicate with you. Maybe they make jokes with you. Tell us a little bit about the relationship with the friendly guards, the positive, but also the negative flip side of that, which is why didn't they, raise the alarm bells when people were getting tortured, killed, beaten, etc.
Okay, so let me just start with the last part first. And there were soldiers who did, and one of them most notable is Captain James Yee, who you may have heard of.
Yes.
And I didn't meet him, but I wanted to meet him because I wanted to see a chaplain, a Muslim chaplain. But I would have been ready to see a Christian chaplain. They didn't let me see anybody at all because I was just totally solitary. But he and I have spoken together at Oxford University and met him several times. And he told me about what had happened to him. And of course, it was shocking. He did raise the alarm. He did speak out against what was taking place. And he paid the ultimate price, which was to get himself imprisoned and get charges against him. He was the guy who brought in books, Islamic books that a lot of prisoners wanted, because there's nothing you can do in that kind of situation. There's nothing to do at all. So perhaps even just a few books would have been something. So whatever he did, he tried and he paid the price. Now, as for the other soldiers, of course, they're part of the system, and they have to recognize that. I used to tell them that, I'm a student of history and law, that at the Nazi war crimes tribunals in Nuremberg, the soldiers who took part in the abuses said, and I quote, "We were just doing our job." That did not and was not an excuse for them to have been involved in the crimes that they carried out. Now, nobody's saying that the same thing happened in Guantanamo. It's different, of course, but the principle is the same. And so some of these soldiers, they recognized it because many of them, as I said, were National Guardsmen and reservists. They were not full-time duty soldiers. This was not their day job. They didn't even want to be there. And so some of them brought us information. Let me say this quick story. This young woman bought me once a Cadbury's cream egg. And now this is contraband. Now, Cadbury's cream egg Cadbury's factories is in Birmingham. That's where Cadbury's comes from. And she said, "Look, I bought you a present because I know you're from Birmingham." What she didn't know is that I hate Cadbury's cream eggs. I can't stand the things. I've always hated them. But she gives it to me, and I took it quickly. She said, "Eat it and give me the wrapper back, because if anybody finds out, I'll get in trouble." So I ate it, swallowed it, and swallowed my pride as well with it. And, smiled, oh God, this is horrible. But, I hadn't eaten any chocolate for 3 years. And me and her, we speak on the phone every now and then. I've not had the guts to tell her that I hated what she gave me that day. But there were acts. It was these kind of acts of humanity. There's another soldier who came from the US Virgin Islands. He cooked me up a piece of fish that he caught, the red snapper, I remember to this day. And he'd gone fishing, and he sneaked in this little piece of fish. He said, "Quickly eat it. And, don't get the bones stuck into your mouth." So there's always soldiers doing little things. The first time I ever saw the film Snatch, ever, right, was I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's a British film made by Guy Ritchie with Brad Pitt. There was an American soldier. He brought in a DVD player. He sneaked it in. He put it on. He locked the door so nobody else comes in and sees what's going on. And we watched it. And these soldiers would do these things just to let you have a taste of life, of humanity, because everything else was really debilitating and destructive.
So there were decent people who may not have been in a position to challenge the system itself or to bring about tremendous change, but did try to do what they could within their means to provide some peace and comfort.
Yeah. And as I said, some of these soldiers, I won't name them because they might get in trouble, but some of these soldiers have come to visit me in my house. They've actually visited me in my house. They've stayed with me, met my wife, met my children. My youngest son, Ayub, was born, and my wife named him Ayub because of the tests of that, the prophet Job, because of what was happening to that prophet. And she named him Job or Ayub. And I only saw him when he was 3 years old. These soldiers kept me from seeing him, but they came to my house and they saw him as a young boy.
Wow, that's powerful. I mean, going from seeing these soldiers who are keeping you in captivity, as an alleged terrorist or whatever, and to the point where they're visiting you at your home with your family. And again, just shows how unjust and ridiculous the whole system was, unfortunately. I know we're running short on time, and Rania and Hiba are going to kill me. But what I do want is, and this is sort of my last main question, and then I'll pass the floor back to Rania afterwards. But so talk us a little bit about the time in Guantanamo, what you observed, what it was like in solitary versus when you were finally in the general population. Any powerful moments or lessons you want to share from that, and then as well as finally the news of your release and your release. And then from there, just the last thing I will say is some messages of what we can and should be doing. And then I know Rania may have some other questions that I sort of hijacked from her, but please tell us about your time over there in Guantanamo.
So let me tell you about the ludicrous nature of recreation. So recreation in the first couple of first year or so, I was allowed out for 15 minutes twice a week. So that's
15 minutes twice a week.
15 minutes twice a week. So it's half an hour. And so the process of taking me out, now remember, you can't see, but I'm not very tall. I'm not a really big guy. I'm quite small. But these big, huge American soldiers, as I said, 2 would hold me on one side. I'd be shackled, hands, waist, and ankles in what they call the 3-piece suit. And they're leading me out, but they won't take me out into the recreation area, which is an encaged place, top to bottom, 15 foot by 15 foot, in this closed area. And there's only 2 cells in this place, and I'm in one cell, and there's somebody else in the other cell. Now, for me to be brought out, these guards have to do all of that stuff. They bring in what's known as the MWD, which is the military working dog, which I always found a strange name for a dog. Then they order infantry. So there's an infantry patrol of a Humvee going with a fixed machine gun going round and round, and this is all the security to take little old me into this little area for 15 minutes. And I have to say, I felt really special. I can't describe to you, like I thought, wow, this is it. This is what it must feel like to be the Godfather. Because that's the only way you can look at it. You can't look at it any other way. You think, what? I'm not that big physically, and I'm not that big in the scheme of all of these things. I don't even know what they're accusing me of. But if this is how they want to play it, then go ahead. If you want to feel good about this, if you want to feel like you're doing a mission to protect America, then go ahead. This is all your tax dollars. This is America's tax dollars, and they're spending millions of pounds on this crap. So go ahead. But that was one of the things. There were, again, for me as a person, I have to say my connection with the Quran as a Muslim became stronger and stronger. The story and the chapter of Yusuf alayhi salam, being thrown in prison for a crime that he doesn't commit, and then using that as a means not to be vengeful, but also to get his voice put out in a way that couldn't have happened if he had not gone through that process. It's been a deeply, deeply inspirational. In fact, one of the most inspirational parts of that story is when he says that his brothers have done all this to him, and my brothers did this to me. The Pakistanis, I thought they were my brothers, and they sold me. They sold me threw me into the well and sold me off to these people because they wanted to get rid of me for a pittance. And I come back and I feel, what did Joseph say? There's no la tathriba alaykum yawm. There's no vengeance on you this day. And I'm not vengeful. I just want to seek justice. I'm passionate about that. I don't want to see anybody hurt, but neither do I want to see anybody getting hurt as a result of these actions. And so I'm thankful. I'm thankful that I was able to memorize great chapters, huge chapters from the Quran. I remember when it was difficult for me to memorize any parts of the Quran, but in Bagram, after almost a year, I memorized Surah Al-Baqarah of my own back. And I thought to myself, wow, if anything I could be thankful of this, I'd say, you know what, a year out of my life to memorize Surah Al-Baqarah, I think that's okay. That's okay. That's not bad at all. And I learned a lot more when I went. And as I said, I learned something about America. It wasn't all bad. I had lots of communication with some of these soldiers. There were two things that kept me going. One was my connection with the Quran and my faith that built. And the other was these American soldiers. They helped me to pass what otherwise would have been a very, almost impossible situation. I didn't spend that much time with other prisoners, but I did eventually, in the last part of my detentions, I was on the block with a group of prisoners. And one of the prisoners was Osama bin Laden's driver. Another was Osama bin Laden's cook. And there was an Australian guy, and then another British guy, and then a Sudanese guy. It was interesting because I thought, well, they got the cook, they got the driver. Have they got any of the main guys, or was it just these kind of people you're picking up? They're all freed now. They're all freed, and people have had different experiences and done different things. My vocation came out of this. My father had mounted a very high-profile campaign. May Allah bless him and reward him with the highest levels of paradise. He fought a massive campaign, and he became like a household name in the UK. And when I came back to the UK eventually, again, I was released in January 2005. I was told by an American soldier that you are being released, an officer. There are no charges against you, and the British will come and collect you and take you back. And that happened on the 25th of January 2005, and I returned home on a British transport plane. I have to again explain to you, really funny things happened. They put me in shackles before they took me onto this coach to take me onto the airport, and there was three other prisoners and about 10 soldiers for each prisoner. So there's about 40 American soldiers on there. They drive us across, takes about an hour to get to the airport, and as they're about to take us off, they realize they've forgotten the keys for the padlocks and for the shackles. So they come along with this giant wire cutters. It was hilarious. It was the funniest thing I've ever seen. And they come off and they snap off our shackles. And I thought, that's brilliant. That's such a fitting end to my time in Guantanamo. I walked onto the British plane, and there are British police officers in British police clothing, and they bought newspapers, of which I am on the front page. They bought chocolates, they bought crisps, they bought new clothes, and there's no shackles. There's no screaming. There are some American soldiers who bid me farewell. They come along and they shake my shackled hand and say, it's a pleasure to know you. I hope that I'll meet you one day as a free man. So there are some Americans who do that. Others are saying, good riddance to these guys. And eventually, when I arrive in Britain, I get taken to the police station. And then from the police station, I go to where I see my family for the first time. My father, my brothers, my wife, my children, and the young addition to my family, who now is 3 years old, that I've never seen before, Ayub.
MashaAllah. So after 3 years,
yeah.
It's such a riveting journey. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for speaking out about it, and it's just so powerful. I have so many questions, and I know the time is just the limit, and the staff, I don't want them to kill me. So I will sort of cede the floor. It's just
he really doesn't want, but it's okay. I told Brother Moazzam when we spoke a couple of days ago, Hassan's not the best at sticking to the script, so that's why
I don't believe in scripts.
But alhamdulillah, I think it's, feel free to keep going. The story is very impactful. It's very moving. I think many people in the U.S. don't know, and we're guilty, especially in the U.S., of just hearing, these phrases. Like I said, we've been conditioned, right? So we hear Guantanamo Bay, and we're conditioned to think that you're a dangerous man, and we don't really want to give time to your story, because that might mean that, we're actually wrong about that, right? It might make us face our own demons about what we've done as a country and what we continue to do. So no, please keep it going, Hassan and Brother Moazzam, and I appreciate you being able to share your story with us. I definitely do also want to emphasize, we'll get to what Hassan has mentioned about action items, like what can we do, and where does this leave us? More importantly, right, is like, where does this leave us as a nation? And so I really want to take advantage of having you on air and ask you about, your personal opinion. So we mentioned about, the murder of George Floyd and the tactics that you've undergone, the same tactics, right? And we've mentioned this connection of U.S. soldiers who are serving in the National Guard, who are now being deployed to protest in the U.S., right? Are the same people who are deployed to Guantanamo Bay and to the wars, foreign wars. So I just want to get your opinion on this. Last Friday was a march on Washington, and it marked 65 years since the brutal murder of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old African-American boy who was savagely murdered because of the unchecked racism of his time. And the late Congressman John Lewis had said that Emmett Till was his George Floyd. And then, we just saw recently the shooting of Jacob Blake. And so what can you tell us? I mean, the really fascinating thing is that, even with the white supremacist who went counter-protester, who went to a protest of Jacob Blake's shooting and killed 2 protesters, actually. And, news articles have said that police actually told the Kenosha vigilante that we appreciate you being here. He went up to the groups of armed men that were there to counter the protest and said, we appreciate you guys being here. We really do. And then one of them killed 2 protesters. And also reported by outlets that protesters in multiple states are facing felony charges, including charges of terrorism. So they're being charged with the same thing that you were charged with. So what are your thoughts about, we haven't clearly come far from your detainment, and where does that leave us? And then, we'll get into what we can do and what we must do as a people.
Well, the difference between me and these protesters is that they've been charged with terrorism.
Yeah, you haven't.
They have been charged with terrorism. I was never. And, so this is the ludicrous nature of terrorism, because when you start to describe everything and define everything as terrorism, it's simply it's a political label. Malcolm X, of course, as you know, was labeled an extremist and was targeted by the FBI because he was fighting for the rights of the black, at the time, the Negroes or African Americans.
Could you? Siri wants you to repeat it.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I forgot what I said. I said my whole point is the label of terrorism. It really is about the label of terrorism. That it's a political label. Remember, the most respected man on the planet up until recent times was a convicted terrorist called Nelson Mandela. He was convicted for terrorism and fighting against the apartheid regime of South Africa. And famously, he said that this is a principle, fighting against this racism is a principle for which I live and that I'm prepared to die for. And as a result, they put him into prison for 27 years. 27 years. So what does this mean? That you're everything, if you start to label it as terrorism, and if you start to regard protesters who are fighting against that racism as terrorism, then you've learned nothing from the lessons of apartheid. We celebrate Nelson Mandela now today as this massive figure that brought peace, but also stood up and gave 27 years of his life and was labeled as a terrorist for it. If we're doing this now in 2020, it means we've learned nothing and we haven't progressed, we've regressed. So this needs to change. The language needs to change. And if it doesn't, then I think more of this will happen. And innocent protesters fighting for their rights will be labeled in the same way that people of the past have been. And it's important that those lessons are learned.
Rania, you're muted. Rania, you're muted. We can't hear you.
But it's more fun that way.
Go ahead.
I'm going to back, Brother Moazzam, just a little bit, because I really appreciate the point that you made. We'll put up the definition that the U.S. has of terrorism, which we'll see, is anything basically related to some ideological goal. And, in the instances in our history, What do we do though then when it is the state who is committing these acts, right? Like, I think it's very reasonable that many would argue that the state itself has been guilty of terrorism if we maintain the same definition that we use for individuals, right? So we have even examples of our own history of the Japanese being interned. We have, COINTELPRO of targeting civil rights activists. And in Guantanamo Bay, of course. So where do we stand when our government are the violators, the perpetrators of this aggression? Where does that leave us? And also, if you can tie in, the work that CAIR does, right? Is that one outlet? And where do we go from here?
Okay, so look, if you look at the definition you look, that's one of the, so you understand there are over 100 different definitions of terrorism, and they keep changing over the years, depending on who and what wants to label whom. So in the definition that you just listed now, it didn't mention any state actors. Whereas state actors, of course, are known. Even the United States has labeled certain governments as state sponsors of terrorism. So that's what I said. These are political labels. They don't really mean much because if it's just about the use of violence for a political aim, then the United States has done that so many times we can't even remember. But you simply, because you're a state, you avoid being targeted in that way. There has to be a system of at least internal accountability. And, look, just as an example, the United States took part in what I have no qualms in saying this, multiple war crimes. We think of war crimes today, we think of the Nuremberg Nazi tribunals and Goering and Rudolf Hess and the heads of the Nazi party. Because that law has not been applied at all against the United States in any way to any actors, whether it's torture or whether it's invasions and so forth, they can always say that we are, you can't compare us in that way. But it is important that this system of accountability is put into place. I think your senators, Dianne Feinstein, did a report in 2014 about the CIA role in torture. Now, there's a film that's made, it's a very popular film, I think it's on Amazon, called The Report. It's actually about the torture of a man who's still in Guantanamo called Abu Zubaydah. And he was tortured and waterboarded over 83 times. Dianne Feinstein's office they went into the detail of who these torturers were, what they did, the psychiatrists who architected the entire program, and they produced a report. And this report says that at least 119 individuals were systematically tortured by, now this is at the Senate level. What happens with this torture report? Nothing. Nobody gets prosecuted. Nobody at all. There's not even a sense, not even an idea that anybody's going to get prosecuted. So what this tells everybody else, and the rest of the world more importantly, is the United States is above the law, above its own law. Now it's up to people like you who have to push and say, if there are crimes, if anybody else had done this, they'd be sitting in jail. All you've done is actually done an exercise in transparency and said, look how open we are. Though you weren't, it had to be forced out. And then when you've done that, you've said, we've held ourselves to account. Really? You've really held yourself to account by telling the world that you did torture and not prosecuted anybody for it? Obama was a constitutional lawyer. He should have been the first person to make sure that happened, and he didn't. So you guys got an uphill struggle. But once those precedents are established, then presidents like Trump can never say and do the things that they do.
I mean, how we took to account was that we took Gina Haspel, who has, records have leaked her involvement in CIA black sites, and we've, now appointed her to lead the CIA. So I agree with you. So
Gina Haspel was in charge of the Cat's Eye prison in Thailand at the time when Abu Zubaydah was getting waterboarded.
Yeah. So speak to us about the work of CAIR and what are some action items that every citizen and every individual can take to kind of further this message of accountability that you've shared with us.
Okay, so one of the things we've been doing is we've been taking prisoners' testimonies, highlighting them, not just from Guantanamo, but also secret detention sites and those who have been affected by anti-terror legislation. You noticed, you noted your own Patriot Act and so forth. In Britain, there have been almost every year a new law that's been passed that almost in de facto terms applies to Muslims. For I think 15 pieces of anti-terror legislation over 20 years at least. We have given evidence. I've given evidence at a war crimes tribunal that was set up in Kuala Lumpur by Mahathir Mohamad, who's the Prime Minister there in Malaysia. As a result of that testimony and testimony from survivors of Abu Ghraib, including women who'd been raped and tortured in Iraq, as a result of that testimony, George Bush was found guilty of crimes against humanity. Now, how actionable that is, I don't know, but this was based upon my testimony and the testimony of others. We've given evidence to the International Criminal Court for the violations that we witnessed in Afghanistan. America's response has been under Trump that they have threatened to arrest. They've threatened to arrest and prosecute any member of the International Criminal Court who seeks to hold America to account. That's how, even the Taliban haven't said that, because the Taliban are also getting investigated, but they haven't made any such threat. Only America under John Bolton, I think it was before he resigned or whatever. We've given evidence to independent inquiries over here, judge-led inquiries that have found that the British government themselves were complicit in torture. We've given evidence. I've given evidence to the police. I sat down with the police and told them, listen, guys, the CIA, the MI5 agents who were involved in the torture, this is what their eyes color looks like. This is what the color of their hair is. This is what their height is. This is what I described them as the criminals that they were. And so the police mounted an investigation. And of course, they stopped because they said, to quote, there were entities that wouldn't cooperate with them. And one of those entities was the United States government. And so we have been in this process of trying to hold the government to account. And whilst it gets stopped at a particular point, we understand the national conversation that Cage has made is that everybody knows now what happened in Guantanamo. Everybody knows what happened in the War on Terror because we were witnesses to it and we made sure that everybody knew. If we'd come back and remain silent, like some have been forced to in some of the Arab countries, everybody would have said, look, nothing's wrong with Guantanamo, nobody's complaining. But we have made it our mission to make sure that people understand the detail of the role of torture in the war on terrorism.
I think that's a powerful message. And, certain funded Islamophobic outlets have kind of painted this exposed theories as being very unpatriotic. But, we'll share with the audience that if there's one thing that maybe Bill Maher and Malcolm X are in agreement about, it's that this notion that you've mentioned, that critiquing your nation is inherent to creating positive change, positive social change, that we have to see something for what it is and take our leaders to account because we love our countries and because we want them to be better. So thank you very much for that. And I think the last thing that I have for you, unless Hassan has anything else, is just, what is your message? This is a powerful story that you shared with our audience, many of which are hearing it for the first time. What message would you want to leave us with today?
Yeah, and more particularly, sort of what is your message in particular to our American audience that is watching as a whole, and in particular to the American Muslim community as well?
There's a close friend of mine who said to me, I remember a few years ago, they said, I remember at the time when everybody used to love America. That's what she said. She said, I remember a time when everybody used to love America. And I hope that there are Americans who take that into account. There was a time that everybody loved it. I don't think there's a time that everybody loved America, but the notion is that it wasn't, its actions didn't cause this animosity that you've seen right now. When I wrote a book in Britain, it was called Enemy Combatant, A British Muslim's Journey to Guantanamo and Back. There's an American version of it. And in the American version, I have a different ending. And the ending says that the notion of American justice for me and what I've seen is an oxymoron. That means that everybody who's had the experience of America in Guantanamo, for them, the notion of justice does not exist because you can't be a nation of laws and then not apply them for 20 years, 2 decades. So my message to people is that if anything that I've said and you've heard sounds like something that you'd be opposed to, then you're not doing enough. You have to. As Americans, you must. And if you're happy with the status quo, then what are you going to do when stuff like what's happening right now on your streets and polarize your country even more? You can't tell the rest of the world to love you and respect you because you're a country of laws and rules and the rule of law and so forth, and not apply it elsewhere. try to make your country a place that my friend said that America used to be loved once by everyone.
Powerful, powerful. Thank you, Brother Moazzam. Where can I really, really want to thank you for? I know it must be very difficult recounting the very horrific experiences you faced, and I wish we could continue the conversation. Where can people learn more about you, follow your work, and if you can give the name of your book again, and if we can have it running on the screen. I see, mashallah, we put the CAIR website on the screen, but just some follow-up information, and then we'll wrap up, inshallah.
Yeah, so I have a book. It's called Enemy Combatant. I think in the American version is called My Experience in Kandahar, Bagram, and Guantanamo. There's also a film that was made. There's a lot more that's happened. We've only spoken about Guantanamo, and my life's a lot more than that. There's a film called The Confession that was made in 2014. That if anybody wants to watch it, you can watch it on Amazon or YouTube or whatever. And that is kind of a retelling of my story, which includes everything we've said and a lot more. And of course, CAIR. Visit the CAIR website. You'll see all of our work and our actions. And again, I have to thank you. It was my pleasure to host you when you came to the UK. It was. I have to say the work that you guys are doing is phenomenal. And we see it from here. It's a real breath of fresh air to see how you're fighting for the rights of the oppressed and those whose rights are being violated. So it is. It's a pleasure to have addressed you here this evening. Though it's getting a bit late, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts this on your balance of good deeds on the Day of Judgment and accepts all your actions. And for all those who are watching, if you're not radicalized yet, you haven't been listening hard enough.
Amen. Thank you for those powerful and moving words and your support. And I think what's most amazing, just to remind everyone that you are mashallah, helped establish a powerful organization, CAIR, that really is courageous, that speaks to the rights of the persecuted and stands for those that have faced tremendous injustice. And this came really, I think, in large part to what you faced yourself. So alhamdulillah, you didn't allow the injustices you faced to put you down, but rather it only made you stronger. And I hope people take inspiration, lesson from that. SubhanAllah, you mentioned your connection with the Quran while you were in custody. Let us, those that are free, not lose the opportunity to connect with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You mentioned the great work that CAIR does after you yourself were a prisoner. Let us, those that are free, use our freedom to help those that right now that are still in custody. Allah will ask us about our freedoms and the gifts that He has given us. So we pray that Allah accepts your efforts, our efforts together, and uses us to serve humanity and be a source of justice and mercy and peace in the world. And I do want to thank all of our viewers and our audience. Please click the share button. Invite people to hear from Brother Moazzam. Follow him on Instagram. Follow CAIR on Instagram, on Facebook, and support the great work that they're doing. Jazakumullah khairan. Barakallahu feek, habibi.
Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you guys, and we'll be back for our final episode of the Exposed series next week at 5 p.m. to hear from two family members of the Holy Land Foundation 5, one of the first cases of political persecution in the United States. So don't miss it, inshallah. Thank you both. Assalamu alaikum.
And every single episode will be available online. This one, Dr. Samil Aryan, I know there's been a lot of great conversations, very, very powerful episodes. So that will be available. Everything will be made available on the CAIR Florida website and social media. So please watch this, share this, and then let us all work together to be a force of positive change. Jazakallah khair, Brother Moazzam. We'll leave you the last word. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Nothing more to say than Jazakallah khair. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from you, and I pray nothing but goodness for all of you and your viewers.
Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Salam.